Success. It seems like there's always a straight line to success, but in reality, for most people, that straight line isn't so straight. Now, is a person truly successful, however, if they don't have a straight line? Now, let's imagine that the bumps in the road aren't just stumbles and failures along the way, but, well, maybe they're things that aren't really the nicest things in the world. Maybe in order to get success, some people lie, they cheat, and they harm others. Is it still success? Well, Niccolò Machiavelli, in the late 14 and early 1500s, lived as a politician and philosopher. And one theory and one maxim that really came from him, especially from his book The Prince, was the idea of the ends justify the means. And though not directly stated by him, he really supports this idea that it doesn't matter what you do, it just matters what you have in the end. And this is an interesting idea to follow because a lot of people use this justification to do certain things. So for instance, this idea of ends justifying the means, what are we saying here? Well, in this example, you can see it says, yes, torture is bad, but we got some good information, so it's justified. So in other words, the ends, or getting good information, justify torturing in this situation. Now, it's not to say you have to agree with that statement, but that's what the idea and the philosophy behind this is. Some people really struggle and really dislike this because, well, maybe you got good information in that situation, but then other people can use the same rationale to say that, hey, I got some good stuff, so who cares that I was involved in armed robbery, which I would think we all agree isn't good. So do the ends justify the means? That's the focus of this unit. And more specifically, we're going to look at it for presidential decisions. Now for this content area and for this term, we were looking at specific presidents including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson. And while they are going to be the focus of this project, the goal is not just to make it so that you can think about them. The goal is to be able to apply this later on to other presidents going through difficult times like Lincoln, Wilson, and Roosevelt during some of the biggest wars in American history. And other leaders as well in the modern times, including Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, or really any other president. It doesn't matter who. Just think about the fact, does what they do matter as much as what the outcome is? Something to consider. Here is the official content rubric that you will have copies of as well. Let's look at it piece by piece here. Let's start with George Washington. For George Washington, he did a lot of good things when he was president, but there are some things that some people might argue aren't so great. And maybe they should be questioned on a little bit more critical level. His priorities were very clear, and he set a lot of precedents as president. In other words, he was the first one to do a lot of things that a lot of the presidents who are going to follow him are going to do very similarly. With some of these precedents, it could be something simple like being called Mr. President instead of Your Highness. It could be something along the lines of just focusing on the fact that he only served 2 terms in office instead of serving more because he felt that it would lead to being more like a king than a president, and that really was followed all the way up until Franklin Delano Roosevelt broke away from that pact, and really, shouldn't really say pact, but the informal agreement in the election of 1940. There are other ones to consider as well. The lack of involvement in European affairs, especially the Napoleonic Wars, saying that Washington kind of starts off, I shouldn't say Washington wasn't involved with the Napoleonic Wars, but just steering clear of these foreign wars, something that will be followed closely in the future. Focusing on the economy instead was another big thing, and also the creation of the federal bank happened during his watch. The one big one that I think many people might want to look at here, though, ends justifying the means with, is George Washington's involvement with the Whiskey Rebellion. With the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington sent out a massive force of soldiers to stop a small rebellion. Why? Well, part of it was a show of force to prove the power of the federal government. So when you look at the specific details with that in the pardoning of people afterwards, do the ends justify the means? And that's something you really need to consider. So consider one of these specific areas that you're going to focus on, and that's a key here. So you only need to focus on one of these items below. Okay, only one of them. Wonderful, one there. Second, we have Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was involved in a lot of things that seemed somewhat hypocritical, but maybe, you know what, he was a little bit hypocritical because he needed to be to do what was right and to do what was best, and maybe that's just the way that it worked out for him. First off, he was very opposed to political parties, yet he was involved in forming one of the first ones as he ran for president against John Adams. Second, the purchase of the Louisiana Territory was something that is a very, well, let's just say, hypocritical situation again for Thomas Jefferson, because he really denounced a lot of the implied powers notions that were presented by Alexander Hamilton in the creation of the federal bank during George Washington's presidency. In other words, Thomas Jefferson believed that the only thing the presidents are allowed to do are the things that are specifically written in the United States Constitution. However, there was no power specifically stated to purchase territory. Even though he knew this, he still went ahead and purchased Louisiana. Look more at the specific details, and you'll see about this whether you think the ends justify the means for that decision. And finally, Thomas Jefferson was somebody who owned many, many slaves, yet he wrote really one of the founding documents of our country, the Declaration of Independence, in which it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So very interesting to think about. When you look beyond this too, and you look at some of the steps that Thomas Jefferson took to try to end slavery while still owning slaves, it is pretty clear that he's a little bit complicated in this respect. Again, for this section, only focus on one of these items. You do not need to focus on all three. So pick one and make sure you're going to examine it in great depth. And finally, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is a very, very interesting character in American history and one of the most interesting presidents that we've had. As a president, Andrew Jackson did a lot of things that are really up for a lot of debate and a lot of scrutiny. First, he used what was known as the spoils system, which basically made it so that he was going to appoint his friends to political positions in government. As you can see here on this statue, it says the victors belong the spoils. That's something that you could look into a little bit more and talk about, was that okay that he did that, and did the ends justify the means for the way in which he handled appointing people to office. There was a major crisis over nullification dealing with South Carolina and their anger at what became known as the Tariff of Abominations. That's something else you could look at in great depth and find plenty of information about, in specific, the way in which Andrew Jackson handled the situation with nullification. Next, you can look at the federal bank. Andrew Jackson was not in favor of the federal bank. As you can see from this quote, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Interesting quote from a president, but nonetheless, you can look at this as one of the areas you want to focus on in determining whether the ends justified the means. So was it okay for him to end the bank in the way that he did? And keep in mind, ending the bank was not something he could do alone. He did gather support for it. And finally, the one that I would expect most people to really focus on is this idea of the treatment of Native Americans. When you look at the Trail of Tears and you look at some of the other things related to the Indian Removal Act, was Andrew Jackson in the wrong? Did the ends justify the means for what he did? Was he out of line in forcing Native Americans to move out of their land? Given the potential benefit that it had for Americans, or for American citizens, I should say. So those are areas that you can focus on with Andrew Jackson. And again, you only need to focus on one of these. Now, with all of these areas, I want to re-emphasize with the points that have been made in all of the previous projects. You need to have multiple strong and accurate supporting details. In other words, be able to provide a lot here. In specific, what we're really looking for in each of these sections is a little bit of background, an explanation of what the means are, and then clearly stating what the ends are as well. You need to have all three of those pieces of this so that you can then explain what your position is on it and give your argument for it. You need to be connecting it back to the essential question, which I think will be pretty easy this time, given that you do have to focus on the ends justifying the means. You need to have multiple references. Okay, that's in order to get a 5 out of 5. If you do not include all of that specific information, you're going to drop down very far. Really the only difference between a 5 and a 4, in case you did not remember, is the fact that in a 4 there's only one reference included instead of multiple. As soon as you start losing track of focusing on the ends justifying the means, you're going to drop all the way down to a 3 with no clear connection to the essential question. And if you don't provide enough detail about the means, the ends, or general background on Andrew Jackson, you're going to drop down to a 0 here, and you will have to redo it. So please make sure that you focus on getting enough information and enough details on this. Okay? So that is our explanation here for did the ends justify the means for presidential decisions. If you have any questions, please feel free to bring them to us here so we can clarify them early on. All right? Good luck.